So welcome back from the break. We're talking about climate crisis and climate change, and we cannot talk about solving that without addressing climate equity. We heard yesterday climate equity was being mentioned. Yes, very important issue. So our next panel is going to discuss how California is expanding its climate policy to ensure they are equitable and how this organization are leading the way. I live in California, so this is very important also for me personally. So please join me to welcome to the stage Dr. Mustafa Santiago Ali, the Senior Vice President of Climate, Environmental Justice and Community Revitalization, Hip Hop Caucus. Amy Wang, the Environmental Equity Manager of Green Lining Institute. Mark Lopez, Executive Director of East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice. He's also a 2017 Goldman Prize recipient. Nyah Coble, founding member, South Los Angeles Youth Leadership Coalition, and also she's a member of Stand LA. And our lovely moderator, Catherine Coleman Flowers, who is the Rural Development Manager of Equal Justice Initiative, and she's also the board member of the Climate Reality Project.
This is awesome. Well, we have a superstar panel of environmental justice activists here, and I think we should give them an extra round of applause. And I'd like to start off with Mustafa, who I met previously when he was with EPA, and he left, and, and is still doing the work. And I'd like for Mustafa, if you could frame for us the environmental justice issues that are happening around the United States, and then we're going to be more specific and start talking about what's happening in California.
Sure. Well, in the environmental justice movement, we often say that communities speak for themselves. So all the leaders will have different issues that they're focusing upon, but everyone is looking to be able to move to a just and equitable sort of situation and a transition, if you will. But many of you have hopefully seen some of the impacts that are going on. James Baldwin once said that if I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things that you don't see. In many instances, we don't see those coal-fired power plants that are the frontline communities, what they see in the morning when they wake up and when they go to sleep. Folks don't see the petrochemical facilities on the Gulf Coast, in Cancer Alley, and here in California also, where folks are dealing with the disproportionate impacts from cancer. Folks don't see the pipelines that the folks in Standing Rock and others continue to focus on and to push. When they say water is life, they actually mean it. It's not just a slogan. You don't see sometimes the lead that's in our schools across the country. So it's not just Flint, Michigan, Catherine. There are 3,000 other locations that have higher levels of lead in their water than folks did at Flint. So we need to get focused. And there are a myriad of other issues, so I don't want to take away from the other panelists who are on the ground doing the work. But I hope folks will take away from this that you can't talk about the impacts of climate change and not talk about the frontline communities who for decades have been asking folks to focus on these impacts that are happening. I'll leave it with this as you transition. 200,000 people in our country die each year prematurely from air pollution. So if we know that that's happening, how is it that we have administrations who continue to weaken basic protections around air, because we know that then when we overlay it from climate change, that there are going to be even more folks who are dying? And of course, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about what's happening in Puerto Rico as well. And now we found out 3,000 people lost their lives instead of a handful that they tried to convince us of. But we also know that last year, we spent close to $300 billion on these extreme climate events that communities are dealing with. And that's the intersection that's going on with environmental justice and the climate world is that we have folks who 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year are dealing with pollution. So we have to address that if we are truly going to win on climate.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. And Emmy has been focusing on greenhouse gas reduction through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're going to hear the amazing folks to my left and my right talking about the work, the important and necessary and dire work to stop environmental pollution and stop the harmful effects that are poisoning our communities. I'm going to talk to you a little about a different aspect of climate justice, which is kind of the transition to the clean energy economy. Right now, the state of California is making available billions of dollars for local communities, for jurisdictions to transition to a cleaner future. And that's amazing. And I think there's a responsibility for us to take control of those investments, right? Our communities are built on a legacy and a history of disinvestment, of systemic inequity, of racism, of environmental racism. So as the state of California is investing literally billions of dollars through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, through electric vehicle funding, through trees, through transportation money, I believe that we have a responsibility to influence how that money is spent and how that money is going to communities and which communities that money is going to. So a lot of my work is making sure it's all well and good that the money's out there, the dollar amounts are out there, but that doesn't mean that actual communities on the ground are able to access them, right? There's a big difference between what happens in Sacramento and what is happening on the ground. So a lot of my work, I work at a policy and advocacy org, a lot of our work is trying to make sure that we are supporting communities to be drivers of their own solutions and are able to take those resources to act locally on climate.
Thank you. And Mark, you've been very successful in terms of garnering international attention. Now, based on your experience, how can we connect the local fights to a global movement for environmental health and justice?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we just talked about it a little bit backstage. Y'all missed us for like an hour going at it backstage. But I think first off, you have to acknowledge the indigenous people where you're at, right? So if we're here in Los Angeles, it's the Tongva peoples, the Tataviam, the Chumash, the Hatchiman, right? So that's up front because wherever you go in the world, there's indigenous people there, right? And so I think that immediate connection is understanding that there's local communities that have been localized over thousands of years, right? And if you start there, that's the same starting point wherever you're at in the world, right? So I think that's primary. I think also it's about understanding connections. Before you can think about how you're connected to another part of the world, start thinking about how are you connected to the other side of the town. Right? The other side of the railroad tracks, the other side of the freeway, the other side of the river. You got to be connected there before you can start thinking about the world, right? And you know, there's a famous environmental saying of think globally, act locally. But for our communities, we act locally and we impact globally. Because climate change starts in our communities, right? That's where it's starting. It's in our communities that are the most impacted. So when we make change on the ground, that's creating global change. Right? I tell folks, if you want to understand the health of the globe, of the planet, you got to look at the health of our communities. That's right. That's up front. And wherever you go in the world, you're going to find communities like this, these frontline communities that are under attack. And often it's the same industries, right? It's fossil fuels, it's chemicals, it's a whole bunch of attacks, but they're going to be found in so many different communities around the world. And I think the other piece is to be really honest. Just to be unapologetically honest, because a lot of times we think, whether it's the United States, whether it's California, whether it's LA, that we're leading the charge, right? California is this island in the United States that is the defense against Trump, right? Meanwhile, they're looking at our communities to expand oil refineries, Tesoro specifically, right? Where you have Long Beach that passed a resolution against Dakota Access Pipeline. Meanwhile, the refinery next door is expanding to process tar sands, right? Trying to become the largest refinery on the West Coast. And so we got a lot to learn from the world too. And I think coming to that with being honest about where our gaps are, where our faults are, that's a good starting point, right? We're not just out here to preach about, well, here are the solutions, you just got to implement them in China, you just got to implement them in this country or that country. I mean, they are looking to us, right? They are looking to us to understand, but it's got to be a conversation because there's folks in other parts of the world that got solutions that are on the ground, right? Those of us that are closest to the problems are often the times that are ones that are closest to the solutions, right? So you really got to make that space for us, and really appreciating that we have that space now to even be able to share with y'all here.
Very good. And Nayeli, I'm very impressed with you. You know, Nayeli is still in high school. You know, so for those of you that are trying to determine how do you get involved and which actions to take, I think that she's quite an inspiration, because she was responsible for shutting down a drilling operation in her neighborhood, and I'm going to let her talk about that.
Yeah. Hi everyone, my name is Nyah Coble. I'm 17 years old, and I grew up 30 feet across the street from an oil well. Yeah. And when you grow up with your neighbor being an oil well, everything changes. I personally got really sick. I got nosebleeds that got to the point where I had to sleep sitting down so I wouldn't choke on my own blood at night. I got body spasms that got to the point where I couldn't walk. I had to be carried from one place to another. Headaches, stomach pains. I have asthma now, and that's something I'm always going to have to live with because I had a neighbor oil well, and that's not okay. So, okay, raise your hand if you knew before coming here that Los Angeles is the largest urban oil field in the nation. Look around. That's a good amount of hands. A lot of people don't know that because we're so busy keeping up with the Kardashians, keeping up with fashion trends, that we don't pay attention to what's going on in our own community. So we started a grassroots campaign in my community called People Not Pozos, which means people not wells. And we started sharing our story and getting our story out there. And we were very fortunate through our efforts to capture the attention of Los Angeles Times and former US Senator Barbara Boxer, which led to the temporary shutdown of Alanco, the oil well. So I'm very proud to say, because of our efforts, Alanco has been shut down for 4.5 years. Yeah, come on. But they plan to resume operations soon, so we're still fighting to have it permanently shut down. And that's why with Stand Together Against Neighborhood Drilling Los Angeles, we're trying to have this 2,500 health and safety buffer zone between oil extraction and wells, so oil extraction and homes, sorry. So nobody has to go through what I went through and the rest of my community and other communities go through day to day.
And what she has described in terms of her own personal story is what we've seen across the country with sacrifice zones.
Yeah.
And Mustafa, I'd like for you to kind of expound upon what you've seen in terms of, I know we talked about a word that I've been applying lately is collateral damage, where a lot of the policies that are in place, they know that there's going to be deaths or illnesses around the country in these areas. So based on your experience, have you seen this actually in action in terms of sacrifice zones, or where people choose to put these dirty plants and so forth versus other areas?
I mean, it's everywhere. You just have to open your eyes. I mean, you can look at the Manchester community in Houston, Texas. They're at the Ship Channel. Everybody do me a favor, take in a deep breath. Let it out. Now, if you were at the Manchester community and you rolled the windows down in your car, you would feel like you're breathing in gasoline fumes. And folks have to deal with this every day. Cesar Chavez High School is right there, so we're expecting our kids to learn why they have to deal with these impacts on a consistent basis. Luckily, we have organizations like Tejas, who is out there pushing to make real change happen. You can slide down the coast and go to Port Arthur, Texas. And I raise these two communities because they're the ones, when Hurricane Harvey came through, there also was the flooding that was happening. So if you go to Port Arthur, Texas, you have all these refineries that are there. And all of the people who are living there are dealing with all kinds of breathing disorders, cancers, and a number of other impacts that are happening. And then climate change puts that additional impact on top of folks because we have these severe storms that are coming through. You can go over to Princeville, North Carolina, which was founded by freed slaves. And again, they've had storms that come through that people used to say 100-year storms. Now they have 500-year and 1,000-year storms that keep coming through, eroding their culture and also being impacted. You can go to Africatown. Africatown is outside of Mobile, Alabama. Africatown is the last place in our country where slaves came into, even though they came in illegally because slavery was supposed to be over at that time. They have these giant tank farms that they have to deal with all the time. Or let's just jump across. Let's go to where I come from, Appalachia. You have chemical facilities who are polluting the water that's there. You have mountaintop mining that's going on. So low income and working class white brothers and sisters are also being impacted. You can go to the Marathon Refinery in Southwest Detroit, where again, when children raise the windows, they have to deal with these emissions that are coming in each and every day. And of course, we know all of the impacts that are happening to indigenous brothers and sisters across the country, not just in the pipeline fights, but also in trying to help to protect. You know, in many instances, folks are subsistence fishermen and hunters. And now there are changes that are happening that they can no longer move forward on their cultural practices. That's the reason I started with the sort of sharing the quote that I did from James Baldwin, is because in far too many times, Catherine, far too many times folks who are in this audience, we are blind to the things that are right there because we don't want to go across the tracks, as Marx said. We act like the things that are going on there won't migrate. So I believe in real talk. It's all right if I give folks some real talk. So climate change has now shown us that there is an erosion of privilege for everyone, that all of us can be impacted by what's coming and what's happening right now. But we have power, Catherine. We have power to change what's happening. Dr. King once said that we come to these shores in different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. Nothing could be more apropos than what we are dealing with. But we can make change happen. And I'm gonna be quiet in 1 second. Y'all shouldn't have brought me here.
No, we need
You have power. Let me tell you this. So folks forget in our country that we actually have power. They don't teach you in class that you have power. But if you grow up in the environmental justice movement, if you grow up in the civil rights movement, you understand that if you don't get engaged, that if you are not the one who helps to make change happen, it's not going to move forward. Here's, in 30 seconds, how I know you have power. How many folks remember the Women's March? By a show of hands. How many times did we used to have men saying 1 million women would never come together? And sisters said, oh yeah, I got something for you. And now they're getting engaged. They're getting engaged, they're running for office, and they said if we can't find folks who will represent us, we'll do it ourselves. That's power. We need to stop acting like we don't have power in this situation. We had the Science March. Scientists, now nobody thought scientists were going to come out their labs, but they did. I was there. They didn't have a whole lot of rhythm, but they marched. I told y'all I ain't got no sense. I want y'all to think about this. It's not just about marching. It's about what that translates into. So we had a federal government who said science isn't real. We're not going to engage in that space. Now we have folks like the Union of Concerned Scientists, the Thriving Earth Exchange, others who are saying we will fill that space. We will help folks understand the impacts that are happening. That's power. That's how we begin to address these issues from climate and environmental issues. We had the People's Climate March. We've had Black Lives Matter. We've had young people who said you can't have gun violence in our schools and we're not going to stand up. That's power. I'm closing out, Catherine. Everybody do me a favor. Everybody say power.
Power.
See, y'all didn't even believe it yet, so let's try it again. Say power.
Power.
I'm gonna give y'all some EJ for you. Everybody put your right hand in the air like 1968 at the Olympics. Everybody say power.
Power.
That's how we begin to really make real change happen. You've got to embrace that. Because if you don't, we're not going to be able to work in authentic collaborative partnership with the communities that are being impacted, and we're not going to be able to win on climate change unless we realize that we have power and we're going to hold people accountable. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you. Wow. Wow. No.
Oh, sorry. I am Mustafa Santiago Ali.
Yes.
Google me.
Well, I think that this is the natural transition to talk about creative strategies that you've each employed in terms of your own fight in your communities. So we'll start with Emmy.
Yeah, I mean, so let me just be clear. My organization doesn't work on the front lines. We work to support communities that are on the front lines. And a lot of the work that we provide is capacity building and technical assistance support, right? So it's all well and good to ask communities to shoulder both the burdens as well as the fight for a better future. But those communities got to be resourced, right? If you're organizing, you're door knocking your community, or you're doing community engagement, you're finding the techno expertise to make the arguments, that work needs to be resourced. And so I think that's where we come in a little bit. We also come in kind of setting the table, right? Folks are organized and folks are holding it down, but oftentimes when we work with specific communities, we find that folks aren't working together on issues of sustainability and climate change. They might be doing housing here. They might be doing urban forestry here. They might be doing jobs work here. And so our job is to come in as kind of a neutral table setter, bring folks together around the common goal of greening up your community, improving quality of life, and taking action locally. And I'll leave it to other folks on the ground too.
Mark?
Yeah, I mean, you know, when I hear creative, I think new. You got to do something new. And the reality is sometimes you got to do what's been working. You got to do what communities have been doing. So you got to talk to your neighbor. Straight up, your neighbor is going to listen to you before they listen to me. You got to go into your classroom. That principal at your school, that teacher at your school is going to listen to you before they listen to me. Right? So you got to make that effort. You got to knock on that door. You got to ask to speak to the PTA. You got to ask to get out to where your circle's already at. I think folks might think, oh, well, social media, what's the new thing? What's the cutting edge thing? What's the new app? That sort of stuff. And really, going back to what the first question was, it's about connection. Because that new thing, it's not going to be new for long. Once that new thing isn't new, something else is new. But if you're building genuine connections with people, that's going to stay there. That's going to be sustained over a long-term movement, right? Mustafa can't get up here and tell you what's going on around the country without going out there and making those connections over a long period of time, right? I'm excited to see what Nayeli's going to do next, right? And where she's going to be at in 30 years as far as fighting for our communities, right? So it's about making those genuine connections. And oftentimes, you have to be really creative to do that, right? Because everybody's different. People are going to get pulled in for different reasons. Some folks are going to get pulled in because they came to a gathering and it was amazing. You heard amazing speakers and you felt something that you've never felt before. Some folks are going to get involved because their child is feeling the impacts in their bodies. And you're going to have folks all up in between. So you got to be creative. And you do, I mean, let's be real. You got to use social media. It's just a reality. You have to do that. And it's not just because your brother's on social media or because your tia's on social media or because you got your family from another country that's on social media, so you want to kind of connect them to what's going on. Well, in our experience, these elected officials are on social media. Their staff are on social media. They're looking at our Facebook to check what our messaging is to see if we're calling them out because they don't want that.
That's right.
Right? A huge victory in one of our campaigns, the kind of final domino or the last straw or whatever you want to call it, was something that we posted on Facebook. We knew that after the fact because they let us know here's kind of what shook us up. When we put that out on Facebook, we didn't know it was going to have that input. We're just like, cool, we're going to put that out there to help further our message, to keep sustaining the energy, especially for young folks in our movement. And that really is where I think a lot of our creativity needs to be focused, is on young folks, right? Young folks are going to have the most longevity in our movement, right? And so if we're not investing in young folks now, then you're gonna have to be fighting with somebody who's been living their life a certain way, who's had certain ideas, who's been invested in a certain train of thought for 45 years, and that fight is way harder than going into that high school classroom, than going onto that college campus, than talking to your kids, than talking to your nieces, your nephews. That is gonna be way easier, and so that's where the creativity needs to start. So if you need to buy a little kid's book and start reading to your 5-year-old relative, then do that. Because they're gonna ask critical questions that are gonna change the way they see the world, more so than the folks who you're gonna be arguing with on Facebook. And that's just the reality.
Yep.
Naomi?
Yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth, but community organizing, especially in frontline communities, where people of color were the most impacted by this, and that needs to change. And giving us young people the opportunity to share our stories, to go out there and fight, because we're also passionate about this. And even if a young person isn't passionate about the environment, but they're passionate about ending gun violence, they're passionate about animal rights and love is love, we need so many people fighting for everything that just giving us, because we're the next generation, we're the next president, vote for me. We're the next. we're the next generation, and I feel like giving us that opportunity to use our talent when it comes to social media, to spread our work and our passions out there, to really make a change is something that we definitely could be doing more.
At this particular point, as we talk about this, how do we focus on hope? You know, there's so much, when I talk to young people sometimes, I have to inspire them.
Yeah.
And what inspires me is preparing for the 7 generations to come beyond myself. One of the things I learned at Standing Rock. And how do you inspire young people as we talk about climate change and in this atmosphere of a reckless leader of this country who is rolling back protections that would definitely impact the communities that we work in? How do we inspire hope? Anyone?
I can go. So when I talk to young people about this, like, it's hard. I'm 17 years old, I'm in high school, I take AP classes, I'm a professional dancer, and my activism is my full-time job. So I always like to point out that I'm a regular 17-year-old. I'm obsessed with my Snapchat streaks. I'm always on Instagram. And I say the phrase, I'm not going to college, at least 3 times a week when I see those college acceptance rates. It's crazy. So just really telling them that I'm one of them, and that if I could do it, and I felt that I wasn't gonna make a change when I was so young. I thought that nobody was gonna listen to me because I was only 9 years old. But it's not the truth. It's because you're so young and because you're so passionate and invested in a certain topic that you make that change, that you help your community, that your community makes a change and you end up changing the world. And I have faced ageism and sexism. People have told me, you're only 9 years old, you don't know what you're talking about, you're still in high school, leave this up to the scientists, sweetie. And okay, yeah, the scientists do know a lot. They know all the chemicals and stuff, but I'm not here to share all the chemicals or anything like that. I know my community story, and I know my story, and that's what I'm gonna share.
Yeah. I think a big part of our work, a big part of our community organizing is getting folks to see our current condition is not normal. We're so conditioned to, at least in the community that I come from, the rail yard, those rail lines, those freeways, the 40 to 60,000 diesel trucks that come through the community every day. People think having asthma is like hereditary, right? Like all of these things just become normal. Injustice becomes normal. And so a big part of the motivation, I'll just be honest, is to get folks to understand that they're getting fucked over. Like that's just the reality, right? That's just the reality. Is getting folks to understand that none of this is normal, none of this is natural, my pigment is not a magnet to lead, right? Like none of this exists for any other reasons besides the fact that all of this is planned. All of this is planned. It's planned for my community on the east side of Los Angeles to have more than 100% of the freeways that were planned back in, 80 years ago, right? It's a plan to only have 40% of the freeways that were planned for the west side. That's a plan. It's a plan for there to be a trash incinerator in my community. And for me, every night, if I want to go run the block, right, I got to see the steam coming out of that. It's a plan that a lot of folks in Santa Monica probably don't know, that their trash is coming to my community to get burned, and they're getting climate credits, right? That's a plan, right? And so we have to change the plans. Once we get folks to understand that it's not normal, that it's all planned, then we can change the plan, right? So then we can fight to make sure that those credits that are awarded, they expire. So now that incinerator, shutting down. Now, Santa Monica, y'all got to become a zero waste community. That's what's got to happen now, right?
That's right.
That's what needs to happen next. Right? And so also pointing to those victories. Pointing to those victories allows folks to know it's possible. Whether it's happened in our communities, whether I can learn from Nayeli's story and be like, damn, that means that oil well that's by my house, I could do something about that, right? Learning from the folks in Texas who you're in the center of it and for miles around there's nothing but refineries, right? We could learn that we can fight the refineries here, right? It's those lessons, and that's really the big motivation, is that it's not normal to not win, right? For a lot of us, we're normalizing fighting back. We're normalizing having victories. We're normalizing creating change and creating justice in our communities. And from the looks of it, y'all are invested in that too. So really, really looking forward to kind of what comes out of this.
Emmy?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I struggle with this a little bit because it does feel hopeless sometimes, right? I'll say two things, I think. One is, I think I get mad, right? Like hearing Mark speak, I didn't feel hope, I felt angry, right?
That works.
And that's fuel. I mean, that works for me. That's fuel for me. That this has been planned, that this has been forever, that this is systemic. When you stop and think about that, I get mad. And then the second thing I'll say is, I mean, our ancestors have been fighting for a long time, and they didn't fight for us to stop. And yeah, they fought so that we keep going, and so that we survive, and more than survive, so that we thrive, so that we're living. Yeah.
Mustafa, I'm going to give you the last word.
Oh, Lord. Y'all didn't see it. Catherine looked at me like, Mustafa?
Y'all can shut the timer off.
There you go. Yeah. I should warn y'all, I came out of a family of Baptist and Pentecostal ministers, so. So I'm optimistic on one side, but I deal with the reality on the other side. So I'm optimistic because of young people like This Is 0 Hour. So if y'all don't know about what they were able to accomplish not long ago with the march that they did in Washington and across the planet, then you're missing something, because these young people pulled that together by themselves. So when you see 14-year-old, 15-year-old, 16-year-olds who are saying we're going to do something about what's happening in our planet and in our communities, that's powerful. That's why I talk about power. You have to notice where power is actually happening. At the Hip Hop Caucus. So I went to the Hip Hop Caucus because I knew artists and entertainers and culture could help us to reach a much larger audience. So I know a whole bunch of really great scientists. I can line them all up here on this stage, and they'll talk, and they'll have important things to say, and you'll remember about 10% of what they said. But let me flip the coin for you. If I put Beyonce right there in the middle of that stage, and Beyonce begins to share about the hurricanes that impacted Houston, Texas, everybody gonna get their phone out. How many folks got a cell phone in the room? Exactly. You're gonna take the cell phone out. Can I get a selfie? And then you're going to look more at that information. So when you have folks like Chance the Rapper, you have Jay-Z, Beyonce, you have Common talking about the impacts happening in Flint, Michigan, all these incredible artists, Antonique Smith talking about Mercy, Mercy Me and bringing that music back and putting a new spin on it, Vic Mensa sharing, and not just sharing, but actually out there in communities, then taking their beautiful gift that God has given them and then using that to share with the world why we should care about these impacts that are happening. That's power. And that's why we're optimistic. Here's the reality of the situation. When you go into spaces and places and you look in that room, and if you don't see folks of color who are there, you don't see folks who come from low-income communities, if you look on the boards, then we've got a problem. That's the reality of the situation that has to be addressed. When we don't address that, because I said I'm gonna give y'all some real talk. When we don't address that, and I've been doing this since I was 16 years old, when we don't do this, we get the policy that we get because we don't have folks who have those experiences who are helping to drive and educate and be a authentic part of that process. So we have to take a reflective look at ourselves to make sure that when we see those gaps that are existing, that we're making sure those gaps are filled and we're giving folks the opportunity to share their own stories and their experience so we can make real change happen. So when I talked about Dr. King and the quote that he gave, it's apropos to the moment that we are in right now. Y'all do me a favor, since Catherine said I could close this out. Look to the person to your left. Some of y'all mad. I don't know what somebody did to y'all. Look to the person to your right. Now, grab the hand of the person on your left-hand side and grab the hand of the person on your right-hand side. Now, everybody try and stand up if you can. Let's see how talented y'all are.
Let's see how talented.
All right, Climate Reality, I see you. I want you to think about something. Every day, we see people on the street and we pass them by. Half the time, we'll pull our cell phone out. It might not even be charged, and we'll look at our cell phone. Am I right? Tell the truth. What happens when we get on elevators? We look at those numbers and say, Lord, please don't let anybody say anything to me while I'm on this elevator. In our country, we create too many silos. We create these barriers between ourselves. What changes that dynamic is that when we touch each other, we realize that we are all human, that we have the same sets of needs and desires that everybody else has. If you look across the room, hopefully you're seeing black folks and white folks. You're seeing indigenous folks, Asian and Pacific Islanders. You're seeing gay folks and straight folks. You're seeing wealthy and those who are trying to get to that position. But the reality of this is that this is what scares people. This scares people, that when we break down these barriers, people can't manipulate what goes on in our communities anymore. They can't manipulate what goes on in our country. They can't tell us that climate change isn't real because we are all now coming together. We're all saying that real change can and will happen. And that's why I say we have power. Last time, y'all say power.
Power.
That's how you do it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of the panelists for being here and sharing your stories. And hopefully we will go out there, use our power, and make that change. Thank you very much.